G'day Village, awesome to see you. I'm on holidays this week, and so this was cut up a few weeks ago and put in. You're in house churches, so that's awesome. You'll benefit each other, and I just encourage you to pray, to share, to talk with one another, to encourage one another, and then get stuck into what's in store for you today, which is the adventurous faith of Joseph and how our lives might benefit from that. All right, let's go. Our series of Adventurous Faith has looked at some of the greats of faith. We've looked at David and how David's faith unlocked how big God was as opposed to the challenges that were before him. We looked at Samson's faith that causes us to look toward Jesus and what Jesus might bring into our lives. We looked at Abraham's faith and how his faith came from the covenant, the promises God had made to him, just like God makes promises to us. We looked at Noah and his righteous standing before God and how righteousness with God might be ours and fuel our faith. We look at Abel and how he brought the first and the best of his worship to God, and that's what fueled his faith. And we looked at Gideon and what God believed in Gideon as opposed to what Gideon believed about Gideon, and who we should listen to in that space. So why not take a moment and share who's your favourite character out of that crew and why? Who do you like the best and why? So today we're looking at Joseph, a man who theologians say is the Christ figure of the Old Testament. And as we begin to think about Joseph, we're going to look at his ability to live with adventurous faith, that it rose and fell depending on how much pride was in his heart. Yeah, we're going to talk about pride and humility today. So let me tell you about Elizabeth Halverson. She was a young woman who struggled enormously with her self-esteem. She never thought much of herself and figured nobody else did, and so she treated everybody in that vein. Because of this, she struggled to see herself as a success. So one day began her career as a lowly clerk in a courthouse. A job which she was eventually fired from because she was shy, she was withdrawn, and she was unconfident. And it showed. And then a couple of years later, out of the blue, she ran for a judgeship. And to everybody's surprise, she got it. Becoming the Nevada district judge. Now, not long after she secured this position, reports about her started pouring into the regional justice centre about her shocking egomaniacal behaviour toward her staff. The Las Vegas Review-Journal reports that in one instance, Halverson ordered her bailiff to rub her feet and give her back massages. Her bailiff. That she took delight in throwing her pen on the floor and ordering her bailiff to pick it up. That she named the court clerk the evil one or the Antichrist. And that regularly made her staff take her out to lunch or go and make her lunch and bring it to her. As you can imagine, an investigation began, and when she was called to account for her behaviour, it was noted that she was so full of herself that she simply couldn't see what any of the fuss was about. And so she was relieved of her judgeship and her position. Pride blinds us. Pride blinds us to the work Jesus wants to do and can do in our lives. Just like pride blinded Joseph in the Old Testament to what God was saying to him and what God was wanting him to do. Now, it's easy to read Joseph's story and think a boy of integrity grows into a man of integrity, a complete humble servant of God. But when Joseph started, he was a pompous, arrogant young adult. In the early years, when we're getting to know Joseph, we see he has a dream. He has two dreams, in fact. One is about his brothers, sheaves of corn bowing down to him. and the other is about the sun and the moon and the stars bowing down to him. And he interprets this to say, watch out guys, I'm heading for the top. We know that the dreams were God telling Joseph that he would go through hell to become the salvation for his people, and it would cost him everything. But Joseph's world was consumed by Joseph. So let me ask you, what are the downfalls of being filled with pride? So God paints for Joseph a picture of care and provision and protection for all the generations to come. And Joseph interprets the dream to mean he's going to be the object of everybody's worship. In those early years as a 17-year-old, there are other behaviours and attitudes that accompanied his arrogance. He thought he was powerful and he found himself to be powerless. He was self-promoting and self-preferring. He was selfish and only seemed to be concerned about himself. He had a very, very small worldview. He made people jealous and then fed the jealousy by his progress. His stewardship of that which God had given him was shallow and self-serving. And to top it off, he just had a general disregard for people. Now, we hate to think this, but in all of us is a young Joseph tendency. I know we don't really want to admit it. But how does pride manifest itself in your life? See, we're all there. We're wrestling with our egos. We're wanting to be served instead of to serve. We're mucking up relationships and causing conflict. We're not stewarding well the gifts and time and opportunities that God has given us. We're making poor decisions that bring us undone. We're wanting our agenda preferred over someone else's. We're trying to convince ourselves, God, and everyone else that we're of no divine use anymore. We're not wanting to be made uncomfortable for the sake of the kingdom. We are all actively invested in our faith being as unadventurous as possible. Yeah, and we hate it, but we do it. But if God can transform Joseph and the incredible dysfunction of his family to become a channel through which God will bring salvation to the entire world, then God can redeem you and God can redeem me. So what's the path we need to walk to find redemption and be transformed? Well, it's humility. Humility operates at a different speed and a different level to pride. It's the wavelength where God spends most of his time. It's the pathway that leads us away from ourselves and toward Jesus. Humility is adventurous faith. Humility is not the belittling of self, it's the forgetting of self. It's not thinking of yourself less, it's thinking less about yourself. And in Joseph's life, we see as this humility increases, he forgets himself more and more. We see humility grow and he commits himself to the role of servant, not superstar. And we see that as his humility increases, so does the amount that God empowers him. As Joseph's humility increases, so does his empowerment. But humility's a choice. So what are some of the examples from your life, let's say this last week, and you might feel a bit proud saying this, but where have you chosen humility this week? Where have you chosen to be humble? And come on, be humble and share. Help us. See, we have the opportunity every day to be humble, to relinquish what we think our rights are, to let go of what we think we deserve, to lay aside our fear of embarrassment, to take up the life and the role of servant, to go to God when we could go to ourselves. And just like us, Joseph was faced with a number of instances where he could have chosen to be humble. After being sold to the Egyptians, he found himself as a slave. He was forced to serve, but he did so with excellence. He started taking on this humility, accepting the humility God had offered him, concentrating on the job that was before him and letting God take care of the rest. So now let's read Genesis 39, 2-4, and Genesis 39, 20 to 23. You might want to ask somebody in your house church group if they'd like to read that, or take it in turns, whatever you like. We get this reoccurring pattern of when Joseph only worries about serving God in the small things, God brings to him large things. But Joseph didn't begin like that. He began his life focusing on the larger things of fame and power and status and fortune and wealth, and he had everything taken away from him. I think as he journeyed from Canaan, where his brothers sold him, through to Egypt, on what could have been a 2-month-long journey, walking in shackles, walking through the heat of the desert, under the hot sun, he had a lot of time to reflect and a lot of time to be humbled. God used the situation to humble Joseph, to dislodge him from controlling his own life. You have all, or you will all, face situations which God wants to use to dislodge you from controlling your life. You see how humility becomes a gateway for adventurous faith? It shifts our pride into humility as we start to sidle up to God and lean into God to face the situations that are before us. C.S. Lewis wrestles with this shift from pride to humility. He says it's not a question of God sending us to hell. In each of us there is something growing which will be hell, unless it is nipped in the bud. People in hell are utterly, finally locked in a prison of their own self-centeredness. They continue to go to pieces forever, blaming everyone but themselves. That is why it is a travesty to picture God casting people into the pit who are crying, "I'm sorry, let me out." The people in hell would rather have their freedom, as they define it, to be self-centered rather than the salvation that Christ offers them. Pride, arrogance, self-centeredness, they live us in one hell of a place, as we see in Joseph's life. God desires to empower Joseph, but pride leaves no space for God's power to be present in Joseph's life. But as Joseph grows in humility, God could empower him more and more. In your house church groups now, read Genesis 41, verses 41 to 43, and see where humility brings Joseph to be. Joseph was given 3 things that showed to everyone he was empowered by Pharaoh. He was given a signet ring, which means he was given the emperor's, the Pharaoh's signature. He had his power. He could sign off as though he were Pharaoh. He was given the robes. They were the robes of a noble in Egypt, the best that Egypt had to offer. And he was given a gold chain, which was a symbol of his authority and the power that he wielded. He was decorated by Pharaoh, but he was clothed by God. It was his humility that was a true sign of God's empowerment of him. All right, now in your house groups, I want you to read Genesis 50, 19 to 21. And I want you then to talk about the place of humility in our lives, given the place of humility in Joseph's life. What is the place of humility in our lives, and how might we increase that this week? Joseph had been moved from how can this situation serve me to how can God be glorified in this situation. That's the cry of the humble heart. Nothing to prove except obedience to God. And you know what? The cross that God offers us, that Jesus hung on, that humbles us. It causes us to realize how little we have and how little we are, and yet how much we are worth to God, and how valuable we are to God, and how much God does share with us. That God shares His everything with us because He thinks we're valuable. You don't need to be worried about yourself. You don't need to be centered around yourself. You don't need to be filled with pride. God has offered you humility so you might know His love. You might know His power. You might know His help. So I invite you in your house church groups to now pray for one another. If there's needs that came up through our time together, pray for one another, look out for one another, care for one another. And if there's things that were brought up through the message, the teaching, the sharing that you did today, take some time to minister to one another in and through prayer. Bless you guys, and I'll see you all next week.